The day began with a sound that was not supposed to exist over Moscow, a low, resonant hum followed by a vibration that rolled through the city's glass and steel. Within minutes, reports flooded in from multiple districts, unidentified aerial objects moving low and fast, their trajectories irregular, their purpose unmistakable. By the middle of the day, the capital's skies were filled with the thud of interception fire and the rising smoke of impact. The official term was airspace disturbance. The reality was simpler, and far more devastating, a coordinated drone strike on Moscow itself. According to early data from emergency services, at least a dozen explosions were recorded across industrial and administrative zones. No public figures spoke for the first hour. State media remained silent. Only fragments of footage, shaking cameras, alarms, plumes of smoke, circulated through encrypted channels. In the absence of information, the sound became the message, a dull, rhythmic pounding that told residents what the officials would not. In expert circles, the phrase, perimeter breach, was used cautiously. It referred not only to physical defense systems, but to the collapse of the narrative that Moscow remained untouchable. For years, official statements had insisted that the capital was shielded by the most advanced network of countermeasures in Europe. Yet, as explosions echoed across multiple sectors, the certainty of that protection dissolved. According to military analysts, the scale and synchronization of the attack suggested deep reconnaissance, patterns consistent with months of observation. By this hour, panic began to take form, not in the streets, but in the silence of institutions. Administrative staff were instructed to remain in shelters. Government networks shifted to encrypted internal channels. Power substations in the western districts temporarily disconnected, creating a chain of blackouts that spread without warning. Infrastructure adjustments, the Energy Ministry called it. But the tone of the statement betrayed something more serious. Unofficial reports indicated that several key communications hubs had been hit, interrupting the state's centralized response grid. Analysts monitoring flight data confirmed a no-fly zone established across the entire region. Civilian routes were redirected hundreds of kilometers away. For the first time in modern history, the capital's airspace was not under its own control. Meanwhile, eyewitnesses described a different picture, one the official briefings would never fully acknowledge. Streets filled with smoke. The smell of burning metal. The wail of sirens overlapping with the static of emergency broadcasts. "It's like the system is speaking to itself," one resident said in a recorded message circulated among private groups. "No one knows who's listening." According to our sources within the defense analysis community, the targets appeared chosen with precision. Industrial sites, administrative communications, and logistics terminals, all critical, all symbolic. It was not destruction for its own sake, it was demonstration. A strike designed to show that Moscow's distance from the front no longer guaranteed immunity. In the measured words of one Western intelligence observer, it was an introduction, not an escalation. By now, the Kremlin's press office had issued a single, tightly worded statement, all threats neutralized. Yet satellite imagery and independent monitoring suggested otherwise. Multiple impact zones continued to burn. The footage, restricted on domestic networks but widely analyzed abroad, showed the unmistakable geometry of targeted hits, not random debris. The precision of the patterns contradicted the calm of official language. In the city center, transportation collapsed into paralysis. Metro stations doubled as shelters, and passengers waited without direction. Overhead, the muffled roar of engines and interceptions continued at irregular intervals. The capital's rhythm, once mechanical and assured, had turned erratic, pauses replaced by distant thunder. "It's the sound of a system losing coordination," an analyst remarked in one emergency broadcast. In the political corridors, silence deepened. No senior figures appeared publicly. No images of meetings, no footage of briefings. The state's visibility, its strongest instrument of reassurance, had disappeared. According to insider reports, several ministries had relocated to undisclosed facilities, leaving the city's administrative core half-empty. Continuity measures, one official called them. But continuity, experts noted, only matters when there is control to continue. By this hour, Moscow had entered an unfamiliar phase, the coexistence of calm and collapse. Official channels projected composure, yet the background noise, sirens, alerts, the tremor of distant impacts, betrayed a different reality. "It feels suspended," one observer wrote. "Like the city is breathing, but waiting for something to finish." Foreign analysts described the strike as strategically psychological. The aim was not maximum damage, but maximum visibility. It pierced the idea of invulnerability. It told the world that Moscow's shield was porous, its security narrative flawed. And for the first time, the capital of the world's largest country looked uncertain of itself. By now, experts within defense institutions quietly acknowledged the scale, a coordinated swarm, launched from multiple vectors, bypassing traditional radar thresholds. The attack had forced Russia's command structure into its most sensitive protocol, localized isolation. Each unit, each agency, each operator was now working in parallel, disconnected from the central grid. In military terms, it meant that the center had gone silent to protect itself. For the city, it meant something else entirely. The hum of defense, once distant and abstract, was now personal, echoing across courtyards, inside hallways, through glass windows. The air was alive with vibration. Moscow, the symbol of control, had become a theater of uncertainty. According to one observer, the most striking detail was not the explosions, but the pauses between them. Those silences, he said, are the moments when everyone is listening for the next one. And in those moments, the city, long accustomed to speaking with authority, had finally become quiet. Quiet not from peace, but from recognition that something irreversible had begun. It was, as one analyst summarized, the day the capital realized distance no longer meant safety. Perhaps that is why, across encrypted channels and dimly lit corridors, a single phrase began to circulate, quiet but insistent: "This is not an attack. This is the arrival of reality." By the middle of the day, the rhythm of the explosions had subsided, but the silence that followed was heavier than the sound itself. Moscow stood motionless, its skyline veiled in smoke and static haze. The city's heart, a place long accustomed to certainty, was now defined by interruption. Official statements spoke of local containment, yet the breadth of disruption suggested something far larger. According to our sources within emergency coordination units, over 30 impact points had been identified, many near administrative infrastructure previously classified as non-targetable. The precision of the strikes left little doubt: this was not harassment. It was a test. In the government quarter, the atmosphere had shifted from composure to controlled restraint. Access routes were sealed, and internal communications rerouted through backup networks. Stabilization mode was declared, a term that, in official vocabulary, signals that hierarchy has momentarily broken down. Decision-making, once centralized, had fractured. Each institution now operated in isolation, waiting for instructions that would not come. According to defense analysts monitoring the response, the scale of damage to Moscow surveillance and interception grid was deeper than admitted. Several radar nodes had gone offline simultaneously, suggesting either coordinated overload or internal system failure. The absence of secondary response units added to the confusion. It wasn't just a strike on structures, one expert observed. It was a strike on rhythm. The capital's pulse, its synchronized machinery of defense and administration, had faltered for the first time in decades. On the streets, the calm had an unnatural texture. Residents moved cautiously, guided by automated alerts repeating instructions to remain indoors. Public transport resumed sporadically, but passengers described the metro tunnels as shelters more than routes. In the upper districts, power flickered, and the sound of distant drones returned intermittently, carried by the wind like an echo of the morning's chaos. For the first time, Moscow was listening to the sky. By now, the Ministry of Emergency Situations had issued 3 conflicting statements. One spoke of a successful interception of all foreign aerial threats. Another referred to limited structural damage in industrial sectors. The third, later withdrawn, mentioned temporary disruptions to communications. In diplomatic analysis, the inconsistency was more revealing than the content. It suggested a system speaking through multiple voices, none of which could confirm control. Foreign intelligence reports circulated among Allied capitals described the event as a psychological threshold crossed. The analyst's language was measured but sharp. The attack demonstrates that no layer of defense is absolute, and that perception is as critical as impact. For years, Moscow's narrative of security had rested on an unspoken premise, that distance from the front equaled immunity. Today, that premise was erased. At this hour, the Kremlin's internal security apparatus moved to its contingency footing. Non-essential personnel were evacuated from administrative clusters under the pretext of preventive safety. Yet, according to several observers familiar with state procedures, such relocations occur only when there is fear of secondary strikes or internal miscoordination. The system protects itself first, one analyst remarked. Civilians come later. Meanwhile, across Russia's digital networks, the tone of communication had changed. State channels continued broadcasting composure, but their pace slowed, and their focus shifted from factual reporting to reassurance. The phrase, "the situation is under control," appeared repeatedly, too often to sound convincing. Citizens began sharing localized information through private groups, reconstructing the scale of the attack in real time. The state's monopoly on perception was breaking, not through dissent, but through detail. In analytical communities, experts began mapping the broader implications. The strike, they argued, was not about destruction, it was about exposure. It revealed how much the Russian system depended on uninterrupted order, how fragile that continuity became when disrupted. The architecture of power in Moscow, one report concluded, was built to manage crises elsewhere, not at home. According to unconfirmed data reviewed by defense observers, several drones had penetrated to within 20 kilometers of key government installations before being intercepted. Such proximity indicated a vulnerability long dismissed as impossible. The narrative of total defense was no longer sustainable. For policymakers, the symbolism was devastating. An adversary had reached the capital's airspace, not to occupy, but to demonstrate reach. Within Moscow's corporate sector, the reaction was immediate and silent. Trading systems slowed as investors withdrew liquidity, risk coefficients for domestic logistics surged. The economic signal was unmistakable. The markets, always faster than ministries, had already absorbed the meaning, the illusion of distance had collapsed. At this point, the city's defenses seemed stable again, but the psychological breach remained. Security is an idea, an intelligence source noted, and once it's punctured, rebuilding it takes longer than walls or systems. By then, residents had begun returning to the streets, but every sound, a helicopter, a siren, a passing engine, triggered reflexive stillness. It was not fear, exactly. It was awareness. Officially, life continued. Unofficially, the rhythm of the city had changed forever. The capital that once defined control now embodied vulnerability. And in that shift, analysts saw something unprecedented, the inversion of perception. Moscow, the symbol of strength, had become a mirror of fragility. According to insiders monitoring the response structure, no single authority was managing the crisis. Instead, overlapping departments issued concurrent orders, occasionally contradicting one another. The effect was paralysis disguised as coordination. Every layer is waiting for permission from the one above, one senior observer noted. But there is no above left to answer. By this hour, the situation appeared calm on the surface, but within the calm was pressure. The drones had vanished from the radar, but the message remained: no fortress is sealed. The sound of explosions had faded, yet the echo continued to move through the corridors of power. The capital was learning, painfully and publicly, that defense is not measured by walls but by reaction. And as analysts across Europe and Asia observed in synchronized briefings, the strike had already achieved its deeper objective. It did not seek to destroy Moscow, it sought to make it look inward. For the first time in years, the city that spoke to the world was forced to listen to itself. Inside military circles, a phrase began circulating quietly: the perimeter has been breached, psychologically. In official documentation, it will never appear. But among those who witnessed the day unfold, the meaning was clear. The capital's armor had not shattered, it had dissolved into awareness. The explosions had stopped, but the silence that followed was louder. And somewhere within that silence, Moscow understood that what began as an attack had already become something larger, a shift in perception, irreversible and precise. As one intelligence analyst summarized it, they didn't just hit the city. They hit the idea of invulnerability. By this point, the capital's surface appeared calm again, but it was the kind of calm that only exists after a shock, when sound itself feels like a threat. The plumes of smoke were thinning, yet the air remained heavy, saturated with a metallic haze that seemed to cling to every street and window. For the first time in living memory, Moscow's skyline, once a symbol of endurance and control, looked fragile, its geometry broken by columns of black rising from industrial zones on the outskirts. The official tone remained steady. The situation is stabilized, the spokesperson repeated. But inside the ministries, stabilization had become a euphemism for paralysis. According to information obtained from defense analysis networks, communication lines between several key command centers remained disrupted. Backup systems were active, but only locally. This meant that each department now operated in partial isolation, unable to synchronize with others. In expert terms, it was described as fragmented coordination. In simpler terms, the city was functioning blind. Every decision took longer. Every silence felt deliberate. And the illusion of central command, the defining pillar of Moscow's political psychology, was quietly unraveling. Sources inside the emergency infrastructure reported that some districts were still without stable power, while others had been deliberately disconnected from the grid to preserve network integrity. The phrasing, familiar to analysts, indicated containment of cascading failure. In the capital of a nuclear state, such language carried quiet significance. It meant that resilience was no longer taken for granted. By now, state television had resumed its rhythm, but something had changed in its delivery. Anchors avoided direct references to the drone strikes, speaking instead of airspace anomalies. Studio lighting was dimmer, the tone slower. There was composure, but not confidence. Observers trained to read state media's subtext recognized the shift instantly. The vocabulary of certainty had been replaced by the grammar of reassurance. When they stopped narrating victory and start describing stability, one expert noted, "You know something broke." Meanwhile, international analysts traced the attack's architecture with growing clarity. The drones, they said, had likely been launched in waves, programmed to confuse radar by mimicking random civilian signals. It wasn't the size of the strike that mattered, but its composition, small, precise, adaptable. Each impact seemed less about destruction and more about revelation. They didn't aim to cripple Moscow, an intelligence officer explained. They aimed to show that it could be reached. In the city itself, that realization had begun to sink in. Residents gathered in subway corridors, not out of panic but out of instinct. Enclosed spaces felt safer now. Mobile networks were intermittent, and misinformation spread faster than clarification. Rumors spoke of secondary waves, intercepted communications, unidentified debris still in flight. None of it could be verified, but verification no longer mattered. In a moment of disruption, rumor becomes architecture. It fills the silence where certainty used to live. Inside the ministries, the confusion had taken on a new texture, quiet, procedural, fearful. Officials avoided making eye contact in corridors, conversations were reduced to fragments. According to our sources, several departments had begun referring to the incident as the anomaly, as if renaming it could contain its psychological weight. The choice of word was telling. Anomaly implied deviation from normality, not a failure of defense, but a distortion of expectation. It allowed the system to maintain dignity while admitting defeat. In expert circles, this linguistic maneuver was recognized immediately. When a government replaces words like attack with anomaly, it's not hiding information, it's hiding perception, one policy observer wrote. It's an attempt to manage fear by editing reality. But fear, once released, has no command structure. It moves laterally, quietly, across every institution, until no one remembers where it began. By this hour, the psychological perimeter had collapsed completely. Officials who once spoke with authority now deferred decisions to committees that no longer met. Meetings were postponed until situational reassessment. The phrase circulated across ministries like a code. It meant, we don't know what happens next. In analytical terms, the shift was profound. For decades, Moscow's power architecture relied on one principle: control through coherence. Even in crisis, every message, every order, every gesture came from the same center. Today, that coherence was gone. The drone strike had not destroyed the city's defenses, it had severed their alignment. Each part of the system still functioned, but none of them together. Foreign observers noted the speed of this internal unraveling. "We expected escalation, not introspection," one European analyst commented. "But what we're seeing is the system turning inward, trying to understand itself after being touched." The remark, dry but precise, captured the essence of the day. The strike had forced Moscow, for the first time in decades, to confront its own fragility, not as an idea, but as an experience. Inside the intelligence community, the event was already being reframed. This was not a military loss, one classified report stated. It was an informational breach. The attack's true weapon was not the drones, but the knowledge they left behind, that the city could be reached, that its shield could be penetrated, that its silence could be broken. By this hour, the tension had stabilized into something colder: awareness. The kind that doesn't fade when the noise stops. The sound of defense batteries had ceased, yet every vibration, every echo of the earlier blasts lingered in the city's rhythm. It was no longer panic, it was recognition. Recognition that the unthinkable had already happened. In Moscow's upper circles, a phrase began circulating discreetly: the capital has entered the zone of proximity. The words were bureaucratic, but their meaning was unmistakable: the war was no longer distant. It was here. Not through soldiers or invasions, but through signal, sound, and certainty undone. And though the day's official language spoke of containment, insiders knew better. What had been contained was not an attack, but a realization that even in its strength, Moscow was permeable. The drones were gone, but the message they carried remained, suspended in the air: distance is a myth, and defense is only belief. As one analyst from a foreign intelligence unit summarized, this was the quietest victory Ukraine ever achieved, the kind that makes its enemy listen to itself. The city was listening now, and in the stillness that followed, no one dared to say the one word that explained it all: vulnerability. By this hour, the shock had evolved into something deeper, a collective stillness that felt rehearsed, as if the city itself had remembered what silence under pressure sounds like. The explosions had ended, but their echo remained woven into the rhythm of the streets. The calm was deceptive, it was not peace, but suspension. Power had not been restored fully, communications were intermittent, and the few official broadcasts that aired repeated the same formulaic reassurance. All systems are stable. The sentence appeared on every screen, in every feed, yet no one truly believed it. Stability was now a word without substance. Inside the capital's command structure, a different picture emerged. According to classified reports reviewed by defense analysts, several ministries had switched to autonomous operational protocols, meaning that central coordination no longer existed. Each institution acted independently, guided only by its last standing directive. In bureaucratic terms, it was containment. In political terms, it was fragmentation. They're still moving, one insider observed, but no one knows in which direction. Foreign observers noted an even subtler shift. The Russian government's internal security grid had entered silent mode, a rare contingency designed to minimize digital visibility. No public statements, no visible chain of command, no identifiable source of control. To outside intelligence networks, the city's power structure appeared opaque, unreadable, almost ghost-like. It's as if Moscow is holding its breath, one European defense analyst said. Not to recover, but to avoid revealing what state it's in. By now, the air itself felt heavier. Drone fragments were still being collected across the outskirts, their impact sites cordoned off and classified. Officially, these were investigations of unauthorized objects. In reality, each fragment told a different story. Some carried foreign components, others locally sourced parts, suggesting infiltration far closer than expected. According to specialists monitoring the incident, this detail changed the entire narrative. The strike wasn't simply launched at Moscow, it had likely been assembled for Moscow, piece by piece, from within its own periphery. Across diplomatic channels, discussions intensified. The language was cautious, coded, but the tone was clear. This was the moment when the war crossed the threshold between distance and proximity. The drone strike had not been an isolated event, it was a statement. It's a map being redrawn in real time, a senior European official commented during a closed briefing. They didn't just hit targets, they hit the concept of safety. Inside Russia, the messaging strategy shifted again. State media avoided visual coverage, relying on archived footage of calm cityscapes and standard press conferences. The illusion was curated with precision, no broken glass, no smoke, no alarms. But the absence of images said more than any broadcast could. For the first time, the capital's narrative machine had nothing to show, because showing meant acknowledging vulnerability. According to insiders, the Kremlin's crisis unit was relocated to an undisclosed site outside the capital. The relocation was described as standard procedure, but analysts interpreted it differently. The symbolism of leadership leaving Moscow, even temporarily, resonated deeply among political observers. When command leaves the capital ceases to command, one intelligence memo stated. Meanwhile, fragments of intercepted communication began circulating among analysts abroad. They described confusion among air defense units, conflicting orders, and the absence of direct coordination. The phrase, awaiting verification, appeared repeatedly in transcripts, a bureaucratic substitute for paralysis. No one wanted to make the next mistake, one Western intelligence officer summarized. So they stopped making decisions altogether. At the same time, economic indicators began to tremble. The ruble weakened marginally, energy contracts were renegotiated quietly, and risk indexes for Russian assets ticked upward. Markets, far more attuned to reality than propaganda, recognized what officials would not say aloud: the capital was compromised, and confidence, once its most valuable currency, had evaporated. In expert briefings, analysts began using a new term, strategic intimacy. It described a shift in modern warfare, where distance, deterrence, and geography lose meaning. What happened over Moscow today, one report noted, was not invasion, but intimacy. The enemy no longer approaches, it inhabits your sky. The phrasing spread quickly through think tanks and military circles, capturing the essence of what unfolded. Inside the city, life continued with ritual precision. Offices reopened. Schools remained in session. Yet the atmosphere was brittle, every conversation carried in half-whispers. Even the city's soundscape felt altered, less mechanical, more cautious. Car alarms, once background noise, now triggered visible unease. People are listening differently, a resident said. Every sound is a question. By this hour, the official response took on a strangely detached tone. The Ministry of Defense announced full restoration of airspace integrity. Yet no new footage accompanied the claim, no data, no evidence. When the language becomes circular, one analyst remarked, it means they're talking to themselves. The observation, quietly cynical, spread among diplomatic monitors. In Washington, London, and Brussels, intelligence summaries described the day as a psychological turning point. The attack had not destroyed Moscow's infrastructure, it had dismantled its certainty. A capital built on projection had been forced into reflection. The real impact, one European diplomat said, isn't the fire, it's the silence that followed. According to field reports, the cleanup continued methodically. Emergency crews swept debris, and drone fragments were sealed in classified containers. But beneath the procedural calm, experts noticed the detail that mattered most: none of the recovery operations were filmed. The absence of visibility had become the strategy. Moscow was trying to erase the evidence of what it had just experienced. In analytical communities, the conclusion was already forming. The drone strike was not about territory, damage, or even symbolism. It was about demonstrating reach, technological, psychological, and narrative. The attackers had proven that Moscow could be touched, and by proving it, they changed the logic of deterrence. It's no longer about borders, one strategist concluded. It's about belief. And belief, once broken, doesn't regenerate easily. Inside the capital, that realization took a quieter form. People resumed routines, but something had shifted irreversibly. The idea of distance, the one illusion that had survived every war, every crisis, was gone. The city's heart, for the first time in a generation, felt exposed. By now, analysts were calling it the day Moscow looked up. The phrase circulated through encrypted reports, brief and sober. It captured not only the physical act, but the psychological one, the moment a superpower's capital stopped looking outward and began watching its own sky. As one observer summarized it in a private report that would never reach television screens, today, Moscow wasn't attacked, it was awakened. And what it saw above it was not the enemy. It was the future. By the later hours of the day, the smoke above Moscow had thinned, but the silence it left behind was heavier than any sound. The city still moved, trains ran, offices opened, broadcasts aired, but everything felt rehearsed, as if the capital were performing the act of normality rather than living it. The official tone remained consistent: life continues as usual. Yet every phrase of reassurance now sounded like a ritual spoken by a system that no longer believed in its own invincibility. According to our sources within the analytical community, what unfolded in Moscow was not simply a drone attack, it was the most effective psychological operation of the entire conflict. The damage was limited, but the perception was total. For the first time, the capital of a nuclear power had experienced what it had long exported to others: unpredictability, disruption, fear. The attack didn't destroy Moscow, one intelligence report noted. It destroyed the illusion of distance. Inside the ministries, that realization was beginning to take shape in quiet, coded ways. Emergency directives remained active, though the threat had passed hours earlier. Backup facilities stayed occupied, and several agencies continued to operate as if under siege. When institutions refuse to stand down, an observer explained, it means they've stopped trusting their own systems. The drone strike had done more than breach airspace, it had fractured the internal sense of control that defined the Russian state. By now, foreign monitoring centers were recording unusual digital patterns, encrypted communications between Moscow and regional command posts, erratic, redundant, sometimes contradictory. They're talking to themselves, one European analyst said. And the silence between transmissions is louder than the content. In bureaucratic terms, it was described as signal congestion. In psychological terms, it was fear, organized, procedural, institutional fear. Publicly, Moscow projected defiance. Official broadcasters resumed routine coverage, displaying images of parades, cultural events, and construction projects. Yet analysts noticed a subtle change in visual tone: more archival footage, fewer live shots. They've stopped showing the present, a Western diplomat remarked. That's how you know the present has become unmanageable. In the expert field, consensus formed quickly. The drones had achieved three objectives. First, they demonstrated technical reach, penetrating the most guarded airspace in Eurasia. Second, they revealed systemic fragility, forcing a breakdown of communication between the state's defensive and administrative tiers. And third, they rewired perception, turning the narrative of security into the narrative of vulnerability. It wasn't just an attack on Moscow, one analyst concluded. It was an attack on belief. Inside the city, the population's behavior reflected that shift. Traffic returned, shops reopened, but the rhythm had changed. People no longer trusted the official version of calm, they trusted their senses instead. The hum of distant helicopters, once a symbol of safety, now triggered unease. The quiet between alerts felt like waiting. "You can't unhear the sound of something approaching," said one resident in a voice message circulated among private networks. "It stays with you, even when the sky is empty." According to insiders close to security agencies, internal reports used an unfamiliar term to describe the day's events: uninterrupted awareness. It signified a state of permanent vigilance, neither panic nor peace, but something in between. "It's the new normal," one officer wrote. "Not an emergency, not stability. Just watching the sky." The remark, though simple, encapsulated the transformation more precisely than any official statement could. In foreign policy circles, analysts warned that the psychological consequences of the strike might outlast its material effects. Moscow's deterrence was always symbolic, one European strategist explained. It relied on the image of impenetrability. Once that's gone, deterrence becomes negotiation. The observation, clinical but true, underscored what the capital had lost, not just its shield, but its myth. By this point, even the language of power had changed. Internal communications abandoned the word victory altogether, replacing it with continuity. The state no longer promised triumph, it promised endurance. Yet endurance, as the day revealed, had limits. Continuity, one analyst remarked, is just another word for standing still. Reports later confirmed that Moscow's air defense grid was being restructured overnight. The move was procedural, not strategic, a symbolic repair of confidence rather than capability. The infrastructure would be reinforced, the algorithms recalibrated. But what could not be restored was the silence before the first strike, the certainty that nothing could reach this far. Foreign observers summarized it simply: the war had entered its most intimate phase. It was no longer fought on distant fields, through statistics and briefings. It was now fought inside the idea of safety itself. The capital had become part of the battlefield, not as territory, but as perception. Within Moscow, that understanding settled quietly. People went about their routines, yet every sound carried weight: a distant siren, a hovering drone, the crackle of power lines. The city had learned to listen in a new way, not for news, but for what might come next. The narrative of control had fractured into fragments of awareness, and in each fragment, the same realization echoed: the front was no longer somewhere else. According to information shared among diplomatic observers, one internal report concluded with a single sentence: the enemy no longer needs to reach Moscow to change it. It was meant as analysis, but it read like prophecy. The transformation had already happened. The city had been touched, not conquered. By the end of the day, the official statements continued, monotone, repetitive, precise. The situation is normal. But normal had lost its meaning. In its place remained the hum of uncertainty, the low vibration of engines that might belong to defense, or to something else. And somewhere beyond the city, in the sky that no longer belonged to one side or the other, the silence thickened again. It was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of awareness, the kind that comes only after the first barrier breaks. Those who observed it closely understood the lesson instantly. Power is not what endures the longest, it is what remains believable. And on this day, belief itself had been struck. Moscow still stood, bright, structured, monumental. But something within it had changed forever. The city no longer looked outward. It watched its own reflection, waiting to see what would move first, the sky, or its own fear.